Hello, this is Said Akshit. Today, in our course on Europe in the wider world, the European Union in the wider world, we will be focusing on the internal security and external relations. The external aspects of the internal security in the EU basically has been slow to emerge. But as we stated in the previous lecture, Justice and Home Affairs, the internal security dimension, has become part of the EU official policy with the Maastricht Treaty. And competencies on justice and home affairs and internal security issues have been developing since '92. Of course, one of the problems here, as in the case of security and defense policy, is the issue of sovereignty and the lack of desire by member states to delegate their sovereign powers to EU-level institutions. However, two factors have driven the external dimension of the EU's internal security policy. In this case, first, the changing perceptions of security among member states in this respect, broadening the concept of security, and how this translates into the internal security challenges. So from 1990s onwards, we see that not only military threats, but different issues such as economic, environmental, and issues related to migration were considered as security problems in this sense, and this helped to develop the justice and home affairs and the supranational dimension in this respect. State borders, the porous nature of the state borders have been one of the issues that helped develop this policy framework because states were faced with sub-state threats such as crime and drug trafficking with the changing nature of state borders. Globalization and terrorism was another challenge that were actually gaining importance in the early 2000s, especially with the attack on the World Trade Center by Al-Qaeda, the 9/11 case. And the post-Cold War environment, the economic turbulence and the social dislocation and ethnic conflicts, I mean, the ones in Yugoslavia in this sense, and other conflicts, frozen conflicts in the Black Sea region, as well as those in other regions of the world, of course. Transnationalization of threats was perceived by the EU member states as requiring common responses. The EU's European Security Strategy of 2003 in this respect states that no single country is able to tackle today's complex problems on its own. In this case, terrorism, immigration were considered as the foremost threats to the EU and actions that needed a common approach by the EU member states. The consequences of the EU enlargement process were also important in sort of introducing new problems to the EU. New borders create the need to externalize its security policy in this respect. An export of its acquis communautaire on internal security in a cost-effective way through instruments such as conditionality and reputation attraction were considered as important by the European Union in extending the area of security beyond its borders. When we look at the evolving internal security threats, we can actually name the three most important here: the immigration policy and refugees. Especially, it has reached its peak with the Syrian case in this respect, transnational organized crime, and international terrorism. We may also say that they are very much interlinked in this respect. When we look at the immigration and the issue of refugees, we can say that it has become a particular problem, especially due to the establishment of the Schengen area in 1990. The Schengen facilitated free movement of goods and people, and state borders were removed and replaced by a common external frontier, making it more difficult for a single state to control threats that would come through its borders. The Dublin Convention of 1990 introduced common standards for asylum application in this respect, and within this framework we can also look at why people sought asylum in Europe. Immigration into Europe is not a new phenomenon. A common approach aimed to create mechanisms to share the burden of immigration among member states has been on the table since the early 1990s, not without its problems, of course. Pressure of poor states of North Africa on Spain and Italy has been the first and the most debated pressures. Italy is perhaps the most reflected in media in this respect. Immigrants, when we look at the reasons, are attracted to the West due to high standards of living. They enter illegally and overstay visas. They are trafficked or smuggled from outside in the territories of member states. We can see here different types: women for prostitution, or children for child labor, or different forms of modern slavery in this respect. For the recipient state, immigrants have the potential to disturb or create imbalances in the labor market, and this was considered to be one of the main consequences that could lead to instability. End of the Cold War created a shift from south to east in terms of immigration. Waves of economic migrants from Eastern Europe has been one of the main groups traveling into the European Union. Germany, in this respect, bore the main burden of refugee flows from Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo in the mid to late 1990s due to the wars and conflicts in those regions. Of course, one of the costs of this issue is that returning failed asylum seekers is a real burden for the member states and the European Union. The transnational organized crime has been the second type of threat that we see developing from 1990s onwards, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There has been increases in the post-Cold War period in the crime carried out by organized groups, and this included groups such as the Albanian Mafia, for example, or the Russian Mafia, which have not been very active in the West previously. Schengen provided an added incentive, as once the common frontier is breached, it's free to move in the European space. So once the troublemakers were able to sort of jump the first border, they were able to move freely in the Schengen area. We can point out five main dominant hubs in terms of the routes used by organized groups for crime. The Northwest European hub, the Netherlands and Belgium plus Germany, the UK and France. This draws on activity from Middle East region and among others. The Northeast hub, which draws criminal activity from Russian Federation and Kaliningrad. The Southern hub, which focuses on Italian organized crime. The Southwest hub, which focuses on Spain and Portugal and criminal activity from North and West Africa. The Southeast hub, which focuses on activity from Romania, Bulgaria and the Balkans, including Turkey. Types of interstate crimes conducted are diverse. Commodity crimes are one form. Cars and cigarettes stolen in the West and smuggled to the neighboring regions are part of these commodity crimes, especially commodity crimes in terms of stealing luxury cars and taking them to the eastern regions. Drug trafficking, heroin from Afghanistan, Myanmar, Pakistan and Laos through the Balkans via Pakistan, Iran and Turkey and the Russian Federation and on to the central and northern European countries. Cocaine from Andean states of Colombia, Bolivia and Peru through a variety of routes, cannabis smuggled into Europe from Morocco, South Africa, Nigeria, and India, and synthetic drugs, especially ecstasy, produced in Europe with the different chemicals being used and smuggled into Europe through different routes. People trafficking is another important dimension of that, especially women trafficking for prostitution and children trafficking for child labor. Another dimension is money laundering. This basically results from activities of organized crime and drug trafficking. Size and complexity of EU single markets have made it vulnerable to infiltration by large amounts of illegitimately derived money, and it's not very easy to control and track this money in this respect. It's very difficult in this respect to determine how much of the perceived rise in organized crime activity has resulted from groups extending their activities from east to west compared with domestically grown groups in Europe operating beyond their borders. So we actually have different groups from the east operating in Europe, or from the west which actually function in the east and sort of use their facilities to smuggle different types of goods into the European markets. International terrorism has been one of the major challenges for European security in this respect, and this could be immigration, and terrorism has been one of the questions concerning the developments around the Paris attacks, terrorist attacks, for example. The changing nature of terrorism made it possible, made it important in the post-Cold War period. In that sense, and a major challenge in Western Europe. Terrorism in the past was predominantly within nation states, originated from ethno-nationalist and radical left movements, and was limited in nature. Small numbers of casualties seeking maximum public attention was the main way of conduct of terrorism in Western Europe. It was dealt with within the framework of the intergovernmental TREVI forum. It is Terrorism, Radicalism, Extremism and Violence International Group that was founded in 1976. But the widespread unease of entering into the European sort of space made it difficult for this group to deal with the new challenges. New terrorism, especially that is fueled by religious extremism, aimed at simultaneous mass casualty attacks in that respect. 9/11 in the US, Madrid, March 2004, London, July 2005, and the recent Paris attacks in the previous couple of years, the attacks in Istanbul, can be considered as problems threatening not only the European Union but countries in Europe, in different parts of Europe as well. Here we see that the war on terrorism has largely been driven or led by the United States, which aims to establish a link between extremist groups and anti-Western states seeking to develop weapons of mass destruction. And the changing nature of terrorism blurred the boundaries between domestic and international security, and thus led to the creation of linkage between migration and terrorism in that respect. Illegal residents, as well as alienated Muslims seen as potential radicals in the West, that could use terrorism to strike back. The Paris attackers were defined within this perspective, in this respect. Trials of individuals suspected of linkage to terrorist groups, and they were actually suspected of creating linkage with the Islamic State in the Middle East in that respect. Following the bombings in 2004 and 2005, the EU revised its action plan on counterterrorism and replaced it with a strategy that focuses on four principal areas: protecting the citizens from the threat of attack, disrupting terrorist networks, minimizing the damage from attacks, and preventing people from being recruited by extremist organizations. Strategy set a framework to further cooperation in shaping policy priorities and counter-radicalization between the member states and EU-level institutions. However, new challenges have made it difficult for these principal areas to work in ease. When we look at the challenges in combating security threats, we see that there is an increasing need to share information, to build trust on neighboring states, and the relative inflexible nature of states led to drafting of special legislation to counter organized forms of criminal activity. Thus, use of the EU to coordinate the internal security efforts of its members was important in this respect. National and EU-level responses developed in concert in this respect. The development of a common internal security regime is as unparalleled among states in the international system. We see that the common interests of the member states has been quite interesting and helpful in terms of deriving integration further to the supranational level. The EU influence in the international system, especially on the countries that it must interact with, and of course on the countries that are drawn into a cooperation with the European Union, has been the most important in this respect. Some areas are more integrated than others, though, in terms of EU integration process. Immigration and asylum issues reflect a more common set of policies than counterterrorism policy, which still reflect intergovernmental nature of cooperation. We see the group of six, the UK, France, Spain, Germany, Italy and Poland, the big six, that try to enhance cooperation in these areas. And we see that actually the refugee crisis that stemmed from the civil war in Syria has created major problems for the EU-level institutions and consultation and cooperation between member states and EU-level institutions in that sense, challenging these attempts of the European Union. Relatively little development took place in the early 1990s in the field of justice and of home affairs, and the external dimension was not acknowledged in the 1990s. The Treaty of Amsterdam was, in this sense, as in the case of international security, foreign and security policy, was also important in communitarizing key aspects of justice and home affairs, and leaving a mixed intergovernmental and community-based internal security regime, a mixed competence in this sense, but one in which the momentum was towards closer integration. The Treaty of Amsterdam incorporated the Schengen Convention into the EU and ended the split between matters relating to immigration, asylum and visas from the vital issue of the control of borders in this respect. So increasing consultations, cooperations and sort of communitarization of these areas in this respect. The Treaty of Amsterdam also made it possible for the EU to conclude agreements with third countries on policing and judicial issues. Together with the Treaty of Amsterdam, the Special European Council at Tampere forms the basis to enhance the EU's internal security efforts. 4 EU institutions in this framework have been created to take the lead on internal security matters, or enhanced in terms of institutional capacity. The Europol, the European Judicial Office, the Eurojust, the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction, and the European Agency for the Management of Operational Cooperation at the external borders of the member states of the European Union, the Frontex in short. Frontex, in cooperation with the other institutions, is the leading institution in terms of dealing with the Syrian crisis, especially with respect to the refugee deal between Turkey and the European Union. These institutions also take the lead in the EU efforts to develop cooperation with a range of third countries through the sharing of information and adoption by neighbors of EU best practices. So EU, as an important model for the development of the bureaucratic and the state system of those neighboring countries, has enhanced the role of EU and its role in the international system. Alongside institutions, the EU sought to develop interoperable databases that can assist the workings of national law enforcement and immigration agencies. For example, the Eurodac has been developed as a database of fingerprints of asylum seekers. We see more common usage of fingerprints in this respect nowadays. The visa information system keeps records of visa applications, and the member states are interconnected in this respect. Schengen information system keeps record of stolen vehicles and other type of commodity crimes, and interconnection between member states is a major issue for dealing with such crimes and challenges. Let us have a look at the EU policies towards third countries in ways of trying to enhance its ability to control internal security, and of course to project best practices in the neighboring countries. When we take the case from 1990 onwards, of course we should concentrate on the Central and East European countries and other enlargement countries, the European Neighbourhood Policy and EU cooperation with the United States. Here, one of the overriding perceptions in the EU is that its own security interests are best served if it is surrounded by democratic and well-governed states. The Central and Eastern European and enlargement countries basically was the first target of the European Union. The EU aim in this area was to co-opt its members-to-be and its neighbors into implementing its own security agenda in that respect. With the process of enlargement, the EU linked implementation of the acquis with the prospect of accession. The practice of conditionality within this framework enabled the European Union to impose its model of internal security upon countries seeking membership in this respect. When we look at the Balkans as the most debated area during this time, we see that there are two areas of focus. Problem of illegal migration. Basically, the region is a trafficking route, and most recently it has been one of the major routes for the refugees from Syria that passed from Turkey into Greece and then towards other Balkan countries, towards Central and Northern European Union countries. Threat of transnational organized crime, especially smuggling of commodities, has also been part of the EU policy focus on the Balkans. The instability and conflicts in the region in Bosnia, Albania, Kosovo and Macedonia has presented a fertile ground for these issues as well. So we're talking about refugees or immigrants not only from the Middle East that pass through the Balkans regions, but we are also talking about migrants from or economic migrants or other forms of asylum seekers from the Balkan region itself. Prospect of EU membership helped the EU to project its influence and power in the region. However, this was subject to the interest projection of the European Union towards the region. Because of the crisis, internal crisis, sometimes the Balkan countries were left behind and they were sort of considered to be states that are to be members in the long term. So this has led to problems in the sort of adoption to EU policy framework itself. The European Neighbourhood Policy basically forms and follows a similar policy to enlargement, but it's short of membership in this respect. The EU aim was to find other ways of steering the neighboring countries towards contributing to its internal security objectives. Neighboring countries in North Africa, especially, were a source of migrants and soft drugs in this respect. Neighboring countries regarded the European Union as inward-looking and selfish, and not interested in their difficulties. The EU assistance was not perceived to be enough, or the conditionality did not work in terms of pushing them towards reforming. And however, this did not stop the EU from adopting a mix of incentives and sanctions in the neighborhood policy. In return for cooperation in the areas of justice and home affairs, the European Union offered a range of benefits, trade agreements, aid programs, and financial help, and wherever necessary, held these back. Later attempts recognized that structural problems such as poverty and deprivation can contribute to migration and terrorism. Thus, the European Union pursued a global approach to migration and provided these countries with development assistance aimed at enhancing stability and good governance in the neighborhood. And this was presented as a long-term interest of the European Union. A range of sanctions are also part of this approach. The European neighborhood policy countries are urged to tighten their immigration controls through better documentary security, the improvement of border management, and cracking down on smuggling of people. Readmission agreements have been imposed under which countries accept the return of their own migrants or people who have transited across their territory. This is very complicated in the case of Turkey, for example, because Turkey is one of the main routes, and immigrants who are questioned about where they are coming from, they're usually more ready to spell out Turkey as the most stable country in the neighborhood. And the refugee issue is a problematic one in Turkey because of the legal basis of the refugee definition in Turkey, which does not define people coming from the East as refugees, therefore creating a problem for Turkey and a burden for Turkey in this respect. EU-linked aid to matters of asylum has been another dimension of this process. This has been a policy that was followed since 2002. Threats of pressure if they fail to meet their obligation was considered to be one of the policy frameworks directed towards European neighborhood countries. Similarly, since 2004, counter-terrorism clauses have been inserted into agreements with the third countries, requiring a commitment to share information and the acceptance of training. The European Union basically has been using coercion and consent in different phases in persuading the neighborhood countries in taking up measures to ensure European internal security. However, the EU use of coercion has been subject to criticism. The punitive EU policies tend to impact disproportionately on the poor and vulnerable within the neighboring countries, for example, while trying to punish the main countries. States, actually, the most affected groups become the poor groups in those countries. So this brings up questions of EU as an ethical foreign policy actor. Also, this issue is problematic because of the asymmetries of power involved in the relationship between the EU and the third countries, where the EU power is limited, as in the case of EU power is strong in the case of small countries, but the EU power is limited in the case of Russia-EU relations, because the EU could not project any influence on Russia because of the status of Russia as a great power. We can also point to European Union cooperation with the United States in this respect, very briefly. This also presents an inequitable relationship. The EU is the weaker side here. And of course, the attempts with the Lisbon Treaty in order to advance the legal personality and position of the European Union in international affairs stems from the fact that the former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger asked, "Who do I call if I want to call the European Union?" In the 1970s, of course. The EU finds it difficult to act as a single state still. The EU has split competencies, and thus this puts it in a very disadvantaged position versus the United States in this sense. And the USA is more aggressive in this field because of the 9/11 attacks on itself in this respect. As for conclusions, we may actually make a few points. The need to further integration on justice and home affairs during the post-Cold War period was based on two sorts of pressures. The need to react to perceptions of increasing threats from organized crimes and drug trafficking, illegal migration, and transnational terrorism. It was believed that only through concerted efforts can EU members present effective responses. Two, the external relations and enlargement process increased need to prioritize internal security. International developments help enhance the agenda of the European Union in this respect. So favorable international circumstances can be presented as an important dimension here. EU attempts to export its internal security regime has not been an unqualified success. There are problems in persuading states in this respect, and this is basically related to the cost and benefit analysis they make on cooperation and increased adaptation of the EU policies. EU remains an international system of cooperation rather than a unified superstates, and this makes it difficult for the European Union to pressurize the neighboring countries, especially within the framework of the European neighborhood policy and the great powers in this respect. Similarly, we used as references here the book by Christopher Hill and Michael Smith, International Relations and the European Union, Chapter 10, and Federico Bindi, The Foreign Policy of the European Union, Assessing Europe's Role in the World, Chapter 4. Thank you very much.